January 17th, 1944. The frozen mud of the Rapido River Valley. Private First Class Robert Wagner of the 36th Infantry Division crouched behind a shattered olive tree, staring up at the monastery that crowned Monte Cassino like a medieval fortress. The ancient Benedictine abbey, founded in 529 AD by St. Benedict himself, dominated the valley with walls 10 feet thick and foundations that had endured 400 years of history. Wagner had no idea he was looking at what would become the most controversial bombing target of World War II, or that the mountain beneath it would consume 3 armies before anyone reached its summit. The Allied commanders studying maps in their Caserta headquarters 30 miles south had drawn a red line across Italy and labelled it the Gustav Line. Hitler had ordered it held at all costs. The Western Allies had ordered it broken at all costs. Between these two absolutes lay Monte Cassino, a 700-foot mountain that controlled Highway 6, the only viable route to Rome. Whoever held that mountain held the key to Italy. The mathematics seemed simple. The reality would prove anything but. The strategic situation that created the Battle of Monte Cassino began in September 1943, when Allied forces landed at Salerno and began pushing north through Italy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, had prepared a defensive masterpiece. The Gustav Line stretched 100 miles from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, anchored on rivers, mountains, and the superb defensive terrain of the Italian Apennines. At its centre was Monte Cassino, where nature and engineering had combined to create what German paratroopers called Festung Cassino, Fortress Cassino. The town of Cassino sat at the mountain's base, a medieval settlement transformed into a fortress by the 1st Parachute Division, elite German troops who had fought at Crete, North Africa, and Stalingrad. Every building was a bunker, every cellar was a fighting position, every street was covered by interlocking machine gun fire. Above the town, the mountainside had been engineered into a killing ground with bunkers blasted into solid rock, observation posts that could spot movement 20 miles away, and artillery positions dug so deep that Allied bombers couldn't reach them. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, needed to break through before spring. The plan called for a frontal assault across the Rapido River, combined with an amphibious landing at Anzio that would force German forces to divide. The 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard unit that had already suffered heavy casualties in Italy, drew the assignment for the Rapido crossing. Their commander, Major General Fred Walker, studied the terrain and predicted disaster in his diary. "We might succeed, but I do not see how we can." The Rapido was only 2,550 feet wide, but it was deep, fast-flowing, and the Germans had perfect observation of every approach. They had flooded the valley, floor, creating a swamp that channeled attackers into predictable routes. They had registered every metre of ground with their artillery. They had sown the approaches with mines that would detonate in the mud, sending shrapnel horizontally across the killing zone. On the night of January 20th, 1944, the 36th Division began its assault. Engineers struggled to get assault boats through the mud to the river. German machine guns opened fire from positions so well concealed that muzzle flashes were invisible. Artillery rained down with such precision that survivors said every shell seemed individually aimed. Boats were shredded by machine gun fire before reaching the water. Those that made it across found German positions waiting on the far bank, bunkers that had survived preparatory bombardment. Private Wagner's boat was hit 10 feet from the shore, killing 3 men instantly. He made it into the freezing water and crawled up the far bank into wire obstacles the maps hadn't shown. Flares turned night into day. Every movement drew fire. Wagner spent 4 hours crawling 50 yards through mud and wire before German paratroopers counterattacked at dawn, driving the survivors back into the river. The 36th Division lost 1,681 men killed, wounded, or captured in 48 hours of fighting. They gained nothing. Not a single yard of permanent ground across the Rapido. General Walker's prediction had been correct, but the operation had been ordered anyway because breaking the Gustav Line was considered essential to Allied strategy. The Texas Division would never forgive the generals who sent them across that river. Decades later, survivors would still argue that the Rapido crossing was a war crime, a futile sacrifice ordered by commanders who didn't understand the terrain. The failure of the Rapido assault meant the Gustav Line held, and Monte Cassino remained the key. Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand Corps, studied the problem and reached a controversial conclusion. The monastery had to be destroyed. The Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino was more than a monastery. It was a treasure house of Western civilization. Its library contained manuscripts dating to the Roman Empire. Its archives held records spanning 14 centuries. Monks had copied and preserved classical texts here during the Dark Ages, maintaining the thread of knowledge that would feed the Renaissance. Thomas Aquinas had studied within its walls. The architecture was irreplaceable, a synthesis of Romanesque, Byzantine and Baroque elements accumulated over centuries. Abbot Gregorio di Amare, an 80-year-old scholar who had led the monastery for 23 years, refused to abandon his abbey despite the approaching battle. He maintained that the monastery's neutrality, its status as a religious institution, would protect it. He was about to discover that strategic necessity overrides all other considerations in total war. Intelligence reports reaching Allied headquarters were contradictory and confused. Some said German troops were using the monastery as an observation post. Others said Germans were respecting its neutrality. The truth was complex. Kesselring had ordered the monastery off limits to German troops, but German positions ringed it within 100 yards. Observation posts on the mountain could see everything in the valley, whether they were inside the monastery walls or just outside them. To Allied soldiers dying under German artillery fire, the distinction was meaningless. They could see the monastery. German artillery was destroying them. Therefore the monastery must be directing that artillery. The logic was flawed, but emotionally irresistible. General Freyberg, a New Zealand hero of World War I who had been wounded 27 times in the previous war, told his superiors that his troops would not attack while the monastery stood intact. Whether Germans were physically inside, it didn't matter. The psychological impact of attacking toward that massive structure was breaking his men's morale. They believed enemies were observing from it. They believed its walls sheltered German troops. They demanded it be destroyed before they would advance. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commanding Fifth Army, opposed bombing the monastery. His intelligence officers had found no evidence of German military use. His Catholic background made him sensitive to destroying religious sites. His strategic sense told him that rubble created better defensive positions than intact buildings. But Freyberg insisted, and Freyberg commanded the troops who would have to attack. Clark reluctantly approved the bombing, making what he would later call the most difficult decision of his military career. On February 14, 1944, leaflets dropped from Allied aircraft warned civilians to evacuate the monastery within specified hours. Abbot Diamar read the warning with despair. He had sheltered 800 civilians in the abbey's massive crypt, refugees from the valley who believed the monastery's sacred status would protect them. Now he had hours to evacuate people through a battle zone where any movement drew fire. Some civilians fled down the mountain, running through artillery barrages and minefields. Many stayed, believing the warning was German propaganda designed to flush them into the open. The abbot remained, refusing to abandon his life's work. He stood on the monastery walls as American bombers appeared on the morning of February 15th. 142, B-17. Flying fortresses of the 2nd Bomb Group, 15th Air Force approached Monte Cassino from the south. Behind them came 47 B-25 Mitchells and 40 B-26 Marauders, medium bombers carrying lighter but more accurate ordnance. The bomber stream stretched for miles, a display of Allied air power that was visible from Naples. Sergeant Angelo Rossetti, a gunner in a B-17, looked down at the monastery and felt sick. It looked like a wedding cake, he said later, white and beautiful against the mountain. Then the first. Bombs fell and the wedding cake started coming apart. The bombing lasted 4 hours. 1,150 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs fell on an area 750 feet by 500 feet. The library where monks had preserved civilization through the Dark Ages was vaporized in the first minutes. Frescoes that had survived centuries disappeared under collapsing masonry. The Church of St. Benedict, rebuilt after an earthquake in 1349, was reduced to rubble. The explosions could be heard in Rome, 80 miles away. Abbot Diamare, sheltering in the crypt with his remaining refugees, prayed as the world ended overhead. When the bombing finally stopped, 230 civilians were dead, crushed under thousands of tons of stone. The abbot survived, emerging from the crypt to find his monastery transformed into a lunar landscape of craters and rubble. Lieutenant Julius Schlegel of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division had anticipated this moment. Weeks earlier, working with the monks and with Kesselring's approval, he had evacuated the monastery's most precious manuscripts and artwork to the Vatican. 187 truckloads of irreplaceable treasures removed through the battle lines under an informal truce. Schlegel, a committed Nazi, had saved what he could because he believed the monastery represented something beyond the war. But the architecture, the structure itself that couldn't be moved, and now it was gone. The Allied command issued a statement explaining that military necessity had required the monastery's destruction, that German troops had been observed using it for military purposes. These claims were false. No German combat troops had been inside the monastery when it was bombed. But the statement was necessary to justify what had been done, and few people questioned it. The immediate aftermath of the bombing proved General Clark's fears correct. The German 1st Parachute Division, which had been scrupulously staying out of the monastery ruins, now moved into them. Lieutenant Colonel Julius Ringel of the 3rd Parachute Regiment reported to his headquarters that the Allied bombing had created perfect defensive positions. The massive stone blocks that had been walls were now fortifications better than anything engineers could build. The crater-pocked terrain channeled attackers into killing zones. The psychological advantage of holding the high ground was enhanced by occupying the ruins of what Allied troops had demanded be destroyed. Within 24 hours, German paratroopers had converted the monastery ruins into a fortress more formidable than the intact building had ever been. Machine gun positions were built into the rubble with overlapping fields of fire. Sniper posts were established in shell holes with perfect observation of the valley. Ammunition bunkers were dug under stone blocks that would stop any artillery shell. The bombing had achieved the exact opposite of its intended effect. On February 15th, hours after the bombing, Freyberg's New Zealand Corps launched its assault. The 4th Indian Division would attack up the mountain toward the monastery while New Zealand troops would attack through Cassino Town. Both attacks failed within 24 hours. The Indian troops, many of them Gurkhas and Rajputana rifles, proved to be superb soldiers fighting in impossible terrain. They attacked uphill through snow and ice, carrying everything they needed because no vehicles could reach them. They captured Point 593, a ridge 300 yards below the monastery, in a night attack that stunned the German defenders. But they couldn't advance further. German paratroopers, fighting from positions blasted into solid rock, stopped every assault. The weather turned savage. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow fell heavily, making resupply impossible. Indian troops, many from tropical regions, had never experienced such cold. They held their positions for 3 days before being forced to withdraw, leaving 400 dead on the mountain slopes. In Cassino Town, New Zealand troops discovered that the 1st Parachute Division had turned every building into a bunker. The Hotel Continental, a pre-war tourist destination, was a fortress with machine guns firing from every window. The railway station was a command bunker with walls 6 feet thick. The Colosseum, Cassino's small opera house, was an ammunition depot. Attacking through this urban nightmare required tactics no army had perfected. Tanks couldn't maneuver in the rubble-choked streets. Infantry couldn't advance without tank support. Artillery couldn't destroy the deeply buried German positions. The New Zealanders gained 300 yards in 4 days of fighting before Freyberg called off the assault. The Second Battle of Cassino had failed as completely as the first. The destroyed monastery now dominated the battlefield psychologically as well as physically. Allied soldiers attacking toward those ruins knew that German observers in the rubble could see everything. Every movement, every concentration of troops, every supply dump was visible to the enemy. German artillery, firing from positions miles away, could be directed with perfect accuracy onto any target. The 400-year-old monastery, destroyed to help Allied troops attack, was now killing those same troops more efficiently than the intact building ever could have. The historical and moral implications of bombing Monte Cassino would be debated for decades. Pope Pius XII issued a statement of profound regret without directly condemning the Allies. Winston Churchill defended the decision in Parliament, arguing that military necessity overrode cultural considerations. American newspapers ran stories questioning whether destroying religious sites was consistent with Allied values. German propaganda made maximum use of the bombing, portraying the Allies as barbarians who destroyed civilization itself. March 1944 brought a lull in the fighting as both sides rebuilt their forces. The Third Battle of Cassino was planned as the decisive effort. General Alexander assembled overwhelming force. The New Zealand Division, the 4th Indian Division, the 78th British Division, and massive artillery and air support. This time, the plan called for destroying the town of Cassino itself before the infantry attacked. If the monastery bombing had created excellent defensive positions, perhaps destroying the town would eliminate those positions. The logic was questionable, but no one had a better idea. March 15th, 1944, dawned clear and cold. At 8:30 in the morning, the largest air assault on a tactical target in history began. 500 heavy bombers and 250 medium bombers attacked Cassino town with 1,000 tons of high explosive and 150 tons of incendiaries. The bombardment lasted 3.5 hours. Every building in a half-square-mile area was hit multiple times. The town disappeared under a cloud of smoke and dust visible from 50 miles away. Following the air attack, 746 artillery pieces, the largest concentration of artillery in the Italian campaign, fired 195,000 shells into the target area over the next 6 hours. The bombardment created a moonscape. Streets ceased to exist. Buildings were reduced to powder. Craters overlapped until the entire town was one continuous excavation. Surely nothing could survive such devastation. But the German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division had survived, sheltering in their deep bunkers, waiting. When New Zealand infantry advanced into the ruins, they discovered that the bombing had made their task harder, not easier. The craters were impassable to tanks. The rubble was too loose to support heavy vehicles. Streets were blocked by collapsed buildings, and German paratroopers, emerging from their bunkers, occupied the ruins and fought with fanatical determination. Private John Clive of the 25th Battalion, New Zealand Division, described advancing through the destroyed town. You couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The dust was so thick we choked on it. Every pile of rubble might hide a machine gun. Every crater might contain a sniper. We'd advance 20 yards and take an hour doing it. Men were dying and we couldn't even see who was shooting at us. The fighting in Cassino town became the most intense urban combat Allied forces had yet experienced. German defenders fought from cellars, from bunkers, from ruins so shattered that locating enemy positions was almost impossible. The New Zealanders brought up tanks, but the first Sherman that entered the town was destroyed by a German Panzerschreck team hiding in the rubble of the Hotel Continental. Subsequent tanks were knocked out one by one. Engineers tried to clear paths through the rubble, but German snipers killed them before they could work. Flamethrowers were used to clear buildings, but German paratroopers simply moved to different ruins and continued fighting. For 6 days, New Zealand troops fought yard by yard through Cassino town, suffering 350 casualties to gain 400 yards. They reached the hotel, Continental, the railway station, and the base of Castle Hill below the monastery, but they couldn't advance further. The ruins that were supposed to help them attack had become obstacles that stopped them cold. On the mountain, the 4th Indian Division attacked again toward the monastery. Gurkha troops, considered among the finest infantry in any army, fought their way up the slope in night attacks that gained small sections of the mountain at terrible cost. They reached Hangman's Hill, a rocky outcrop 200 yards from the monastery, and held it against repeated counterattacks. But they couldn't take the monastery itself. German paratroopers, fighting from positions that made them almost invisible, stopped every assault. Lieutenant Colonel Glennie of the Royal Sussex Regiment led a company attack on Point 445, another position below the monastery. Of 150 men who started the attack, 34 survived. They didn't take the position. The mountain was claiming lives at a rate that couldn't be sustained. After 8 days of fighting, Freiburg called off the 3rd Battle of Cassino. The New Zealand Corps had suffered 2,000 casualties. The Indian Division had lost 3,000 men. German casualties were estimated at 350 killed and wounded. The mathematics were unsustainable. Monte Cassino remained in German hands, and the Gustav Line held firm. The failure of 3 successive battles created a crisis in Allied command. General Alexander considered abandoning the Italian campaign entirely, concentrating forces for the invasion of France. General Clark argued that Italy tied down German divisions that would otherwise fight in France. The debate went to the combined chiefs of staff and ultimately to Churchill and Roosevelt. The decision was made to make one more attempt, but this time with a completely different approach. Instead of frontal assaults on Cassino, the Allies would attack along a 20-mile front. overwhelming German defences through simultaneous pressure at multiple points. Operation Diadem was planned as the largest offensive of the Italian campaign. The build-up took 6 weeks. Alexander assembled 14 divisions, over 300,000 men, along the Gustav Line. The British Eighth Army would attack in the Liri Valley, the main avenue of approach. The Second Polish Corps would attack Monte Cassino from the north, cutting off the German garrison. The French Expeditionary Corps would attack through the mountains to the south, turning the German flank. Fifth Army would maintain pressure across the entire front. 1,060 artillery pieces were assembled, the largest concentration yet. 3,000 aircraft were available for support. The logistics were staggering. 20,000 tons of ammunition were stockpiled. 1,000 tons of engineering equipment were positioned for river crossings and obstacle clearing. 50,000 tons of fuel were accumulated. The offensive would begin on May 11, 1944. The Second Polish Corps, assigned to take Monte Cassino, had a special motivation. Commanded by Lieutenant General Ladislaw Anders, the Polish Corps consisted of soldiers who had escaped Soviet captivity, fought their way across Russia, Persia and the Middle East, and were determined to fight Germans anywhere they could be found. Poland was occupied by both Nazis and Soviets. These men had nowhere to go home to. The only way they could fight for Poland was to defeat Germans wherever they encountered them. Anders told his troops that taking Monte Cassino would honour Polish courage in a war where Poland had been the first to fight and the first to fall. They would attack a position that had defeated British, Indian, New Zealand, and American troops. They would attack uphill against elite German paratroopers in fortified positions, and they would take that mountain because Poland's honour demanded it. May 11th, 1944, 11 p.m. The artillery barrage that opened Operation Diadem was the heaviest yet fired in Italy. 160 guns firing simultaneously created a sound like continuous thunder. The ground shook for miles around. German positions disappeared under a carpet of explosions. The barrage lasted 2 hours, then shifted to pre-planned targets as Allied infantry advanced. On the Garigliano River, British troops launched assault crossings in the darkness. In the Liri Valley, Canadian tanks with specialised bridging equipment pushed toward the German main line. In the mountains to the south, French colonial troops, many of them Moroccan Goumiers, began infiltrating through terrain the Germans considered impassable. And on Monte Cassino, the Second Polish Corps began its attack. The Poles attacked at night, climbing the steep slopes in darkness to achieve surprise. The 5th Kresowa Infantry Division attacked from the northeast toward Colle Sant'Angelo, a fortified position that overlooked the monastery. The 3rd Carpathian Division attacked from the north toward Point 593, the ridge Indian troops had briefly held in February. Both divisions encountered German defences that had not been weakened by the bombardment. Machine gun nests blasted into rock opened fire at close range. Pre-sighted artillery fell with devastating accuracy. The Poles advanced anyway, accepting casualties that would have stopped less motivated troops. By dawn on May 12th, they had gained 500 yards at a cost of 850 men killed or wounded. They held tenuous positions on the lower slopes but were nowhere near the monastery. The pattern of the first 3 battles seemed to be repeating. The mountain was consuming attackers while defenders held firm. But this time, events elsewhere were changing the tactical situation. In the Liri Valley, the British Eighth Army had broken through the German main line. Canadian tanks, supported by specialised armour, had crossed the Gari River and were exploiting into the German rear areas. To the south, French colonial troops had penetrated deep into the mountains, threatening to cut the highway to Rome. Kesselring, watching his defensive line crack, in multiple places, faced the decision every defender fears. He could hold Cassino and lose his army, or he could withdraw and lose the position. On May 16th, he ordered a fighting withdrawal. The Gustav Lien, held for 4 months at terrible cost, was to be abandoned. The German 1st Parachute Division received orders to evacuate Monte Cassino on the night of May 16th to 17th. They had held the mountain against 5 major assaults, inflicting over 20,000 Allied casualties, while suffering fewer than 2,000 themselves. They had fought with skill and courage that earned the respect of every enemy they faced. Now they would withdraw in the darkness, leaving behind the positions they had held so successfully. The Poles, attacking again on the morning of May 17th, encountered only rearguards. Small groups of German paratroopers fought delaying actions to cover the withdrawal, sacrificing themselves so their comrades could escape. The Poles advanced cautiously, expecting ambushes at every turn. They climbed toward the monastery, still unsure if it was truly abandoned or if Germans waited in the ruins for a final battle. At 10:20 a.m. on May 18, 1944, a patrol from the 12th Podolski Lancers Regiment, 2nd Polish Corps, reached the ruins of Monte Cassino Monastery. Lieutenant Kazimierz Gurbiel led his scouts through shattered walls and crater-pocked courtyards, searching for Germans. The monastery was empty. The German paratroopers had withdrawn completely, leaving only booby traps and the devastation of 5 months of battle. Gurbiel climbed to the highest point of the ruins and unfurled a Polish flag, a banner carried from Poland in 1939, hidden through Soviet captivity, brought across continents and battlefields. The red and white flag flying over Monte Cassino was photographed by war correspondents and appeared in newspapers worldwide. Poland, occupied and divided, had no territory to call its own, but for one moment, the most contested piece of ground in Italy belonged to Polish soldiers. The cost of taking Monte Cassino stunned even commanders who had seen years of war. The 2nd Polish Corps suffered 3,179 casualties in 7 days of fighting. Total Allied casualties for the 4 battles of Cassino exceeded 55,000 killed, wounded and missing. German casualties were approximately 20,000. The monastery itself was irreparably damaged. What bombing had begun, artillery and close combat had completed. The ancient structures were rubble, the library was ashes, the art and manuscripts saved by Lieutenant Schlegel were all that remained of a millennium and a half of accumulated culture. The monks, scattered to refugee camps and Vatican shelters, would not return to Monte Cassino until after the war ended. The strategic results of capturing Monte Cassino justified the cost, at least by the cold mathematics of military planning. The breach of the Gustav Line opened the route to Rome. Allied forces advanced rapidly up Highway 6, the road they had fought so hard to open. German forces withdrew to successive defensive lines, fighting delaying actions but unable to stop the Allied advance. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, the first Axis capital to be liberated. 2 days later, Allied forces landed in Normandy, beginning the campaign that would end the war in Europe. Monte Cassino became a secondary story, overtaken by events in France. But for the soldiers who fought there, Monte Cassino was never secondary. British veterans spoke of it in tones usually reserved for the Somme. New Zealand troops, who prided themselves on their battlefield achievements, considered Cassino their hardest fight. Indian Army historians ranked it alongside battles in Burma for sheer difficulty. American soldiers who survived the Rapido crossing never forgot that river, and Polish troops made Monte Cassino the central event of their war in the West, the battle that proved Polish courage when Poland itself had ceased to exist on any map. The mountain had tested everyone who fought there, attackers and defenders alike, and found most of them wanting. The terrain, the fortifications, the determination of the defenders had combined to create a battlefield where conventional tactics failed and victory went to whoever could endure the longest. The controversy over bombing the monastery never entirely faded. Post-war investigations confirmed that German troops were not using the monastery for military purposes when it was destroyed. Abbot Diemar's testimony, given after the war, confirmed that Germans had respected the abbey's neutrality until after the bombing. General Freiberg, asked about the decision years later, maintained that the bombing was militarily necessary regardless of whether Germans were physically inside the walls. The psychological impact of the monastery on his troops justified its destruction. General Clark, who opposed the bombing, noted in his memoirs that the rubble proved more defensible than the intact building, validating his original objections. The debate became a case study in military ethics. When does military necessity override cultural preservation? Who decides what military necessity means? Can the destruction of irreplaceable cultural sites ever be justified, or does such destruction make winners into barbarians regardless of the justice of their cause? The monastery was rebuilt after the war, a decade-long project that attempted to recreate what had been destroyed. The reconstruction followed original plans where they existed, used traditional methods where possible, and created a building that looked similar to what had been lost. But it wasn't the same. The stones were new, the frescoes were copies, the library was restocked with modern editions, not manuscripts that had survived centuries. What was rebuilt was a monument, beautiful and functional, But it wasn't the monastery that St. Benedict had founded, that monks had maintained through the fall of Rome, through medieval chaos, through wars and earthquakes and plagues. That monastery ended on February 15th, 1944, destroyed in 4 hours by men who believed they had no choice. Walking through the rebuilt monastery today, visitors see little evidence of the battle. The craters are filled. The fortifications are dismantled. Gardens grow where men died. But the Polish cemetery on the mountainside below the monastery preserves the memory of what happened here. 1,072 graves, each marked with a simple cross, hold the remains of Polish soldiers who fell taking Monte Cassino. The cemetery's entrance bears a poem by one of the soldiers who fought there. "We Polish soldiers, for our freedom and yours, have given our souls to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland." That inscription captures the tragic complexity of the battle. Soldiers fighting for a homeland they couldn't return to, dying for a cause larger than military victory. The German cemetery at Cassino holds 20,059 graves, mostly young men of the 1st Parachute Division and other units that fought in the battle. They defended a position with skill and courage, fighting for a regime that would ultimately be judged among history's greatest evils. Their tactical excellence doesn't redeem the cause they fought for, but it does complicate simplistic narratives of the battle. The British, Indian, and New Zealand troops who died at Cassino are buried in Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries nearby. The American dead from the Rapido crossing rest at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery at Nettuno, their graves are lined in perfect rows under marble crosses. The French colonial troops, many of whom had no choice about fighting, are buried in a separate cemetery maintained by the French government. Every cemetery is immaculate, every grave tended, every name recorded. The nations that fought at Monte Cassino remember their dead, even if they've forgotten the details of why those men died. The military lessons of Monte Cassino influenced post-war thinking about combat in mountainous terrain. The battle demonstrated that air power, for all its destructive capability, couldn't substitute for infantry taking and holding ground. The bombing of the monastery and town created obstacles for attackers, rather than eliminating defences. Artillery, even in unprecedented concentrations, couldn't destroy positions blasted into solid rock. Tanks were largely ineffective in the rubble-choked streets and crater-pocked slopes. Victory ultimately came down to infantry, supported by artillery and engineers, fighting yard by yard in conditions that tested human endurance beyond what peacetime soldiers believed possible. The Polish success where others failed owed less to superior tactics than to superior motivation. Anders's troops accepted casualties that would have broken less committed units because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to fight for. The controversy over whether Monte Cassino should have been bombed remains unresolved and probably unresolvable. Military historians debate whether the monastery's destruction was justified by military necessity or was a war crime against cultural heritage. The International Committee of the Red Cross investigated after the war and concluded that bombing was not justified by evidence available at the time. UNESCO studied the case when establishing cultural heritage protection protocols and used Monte Cassino as an example of what should not be done. The United Nations included protections for cultural sites in the Geneva Conventions, partly because of lessons from this battle. But military officers studying the campaign note that soldiers dying under fire from a mountain position are unlikely to care about the cultural significance of buildings on that mountain. The tension between military necessity and cultural preservation has no easy resolution. What is clear, looking back 80 years, is that Monte Cassino represented a kind of warfare that modern armies hope to avoid. Frontal assaults against prepared defences in restrictive terrain produce casualty rates that democratic societies struggle to accept. The battle consumed 5 months and 75,000 casualties to gain a position that clever manoeuvre ultimately bypassed. The Allied success in the Lire Valley and the French breakthrough in the mountains forced German withdrawal from Cassino more effectively than any frontal assault. The mountain was won strategically before it was captured tactically. This suggests that the 4 direct assaults on Cassino were, in retrospect, unnecessary, that patience and operational art would have achieved the same result at lower cost. But commanders in early 1944 didn't have the luxury of hindsight. They faced German defences that had stopped multiple offensives, political pressure to advance toward Rome, and the approaching deadline of the Normandy invasion. They ordered attacks because they believed attacks were necessary, and soldiers died because commanders couldn't imagine another way. The monastery ruins themselves became a memorial of sorts, deliberately left partially destroyed to remind visitors of what happened here. Some walls were reconstructed, some left as ruins. The combination of old and new, destroyed and rebuilt, creates an unsettling effect. This is a place where something terrible happened, where human choices created tragedy on a scale that still resonates. School groups visit from across Europe, learning about the battle as part of their World War II education. They see the Polish cemetery, they walk through the reconstructed monastery, they look down at the Liri Valley and try to imagine what soldiers saw from these heights. Whether they truly understand what happened here is questionable. The battle was too complex, too tragic, too tangled in moral ambiguity to reduce to simple lessons. On anniversary dates, veterans return to Monte Cassino, fewer each year as time claims survivors that bullets missed. They gather at the cemeteries, British and German and Polish and Indian veterans, old men now, some in wheelchairs, some supported by children and grandchildren. They remember comrades who never grew old, who remained forever young in memories of shared hardship. The antagonism of 1944 has faded. German paratroopers and Polish infantry who tried to kill each other on these slopes now shake hands at memorial ceremonies. They share a bond forged in combat that civilians can never fully understand. They fought each other with determination. They inflicted terrible casualties on each other, and now they're among the few people alive who truly know what happened on this mountain. The Battle of Monte Cassino stands as one of World War II's most difficult engagements, a fight where terrain and fortifications combined with skilled defenders to create a battlefield that tested attackers beyond their limits. 4 major battles, 130 days of combat, 75,000 casualties, and the destruction of a 1,400-year-old monastery later, Allied forces finally stood on the summit. They had broken the Gustav Line and opened the road to Rome. They had proven that no defensive position, however strong, could hold against sustained Allied pressure. But the price was terrible, the methods were controversial, and the victory was compromised by the cultural destruction required to achieve it. Monte Cassino remains a monument to the brutal reality that in total war nothing is sacred, not churches, not history, not culture. Everything can be destroyed if commanders believe military necessity demands it. Whether those beliefs were correct, whether the ends justified the means, whether victory was worth the price, these are questions without satisfying answers, questions that each person must answer according to their own values and understanding. The mountain stands silent now, peaceful and beautiful, gardens growing where artillery once fell, tourists photographing views that machine gunners once used to kill. But the blood soaked into that rocky soil doesn't wash away with time, and the ghosts of 75,000 casualties still haunt Monte Cassino, asking questions that the living cannot answer. The strategic aftermath of Monte Cassino extended far beyond the immediate capture of the mountain and the advance to Rome. The battle fundamentally altered Allied thinking about urban warfare, defensive positions, and the limits of air power. In June 1944, as Allied planners prepared for the invasion of France and subsequent campaigns in Germany, they studied the Cassino experience intensively. The lessons were sobering and often contradicted pre-war doctrine that had guided Allied operations. The first lesson was that preparatory bombing of urban areas created obstacles rather than eliminating resistance. This directly contradicted the prevailing belief that massive bombardment would soften up defensive positions and make infantry advance easier. At Cassino, both the monastery and town, bombings had produced exactly the opposite result. The rubble blocked vehicle movement, created countless hiding places for defenders, and made target identification almost impossible. Artillery observers couldn't see into the destroyed town. Tank commanders couldn't navigate streets that no longer existed. Infantry advanced blind into a landscape where every pile of debris might conceal a machine gun nest. General Lucian Truscott, who commanded divisions in the Italian campaign, wrote in his after-action analysis that bombing Cassino town was the single most counterproductive tactical decision of the Italian campaign. We gave the Germans better positions than they could have built themselves, and we paid for our error in blood. The British Army's Operational Research Section conducted detailed studies of the bombing's effectiveness. They calculated that each ton of bombs dropped on Cassino town created approximately 15 cubic yards of rubble and debris. With over 1,000 tons dropped on the town, this created more than 15,000 cubic yards of obstacles that Allied forces had to fight through. The study concluded that the bombing increased the time required to capture the town by a factor of 3 compared to fighting through intact buildings. German defensive preparations in the town, which had taken engineers 2 months to construct, were less effective as obstacles than the bomb damage that Allied air power created in 4 hours. This lesson would influence Allied decisions about bombing French and German cities later in 1944. When faced with similar situations, commanders would often choose to bypass heavily defended urban areas rather than bomb them into rubble that would slow their own advance. The second lesson concerned the limitations of artillery in mountain warfare. The Gustav Line battles saw artillery concentrations unprecedented in the Mediterranean theatre. On May 11, 1944, the opening barrage of Operation Diadem involved 1,060 guns firing for 2 hours, expending 195,000 shells in that period alone. The weight of explosives dropped on German positions exceeded anything seen on the Western Front in 1918. Yet German defenders in positions blasted into solid rock survived with their fighting capability intact. Post-battle investigations of German bunkers on Monte Cassino revealed why. The typical German defensive position consisted of a room carved 15 to 20 feet into solid limestone, with only a small firing aperture exposed to artillery. The rock itself absorbed blast effects. Even direct hits on apertures rarely penetrated far enough to harm occupants. German paratroopers would shelter during bombardments, then emerge when Allied infantry appeared, and resume fighting from positions that showed no visible damage. British artillery officers calculated that destroying one German bunker position on Monte Cassino required an average of 200 direct hits from 105mm or larger shells. Given the difficulty of achieving direct hits on targets that were often only a few feet across, this meant that destroying a single position might require thousands of shells. With dozens of such positions on the mountain, the ammunition expenditure required to eliminate German defences through artillery alone would have been impossibly large. The solution, painfully learned, was that mountain positions had to be taken by infantry assaults supported by artillery, not by artillery preparation followed by infantry occupation. This meant accepting higher infantry casualties in exchange for achieving tactical objectives, a trade-off that no commander made willingly, but that the terrain at Cassino forced upon them. The third lesson concerned the value of elite infantry in defensive operations. The German 1st Parachute Division that held Monte Cassino for 130 days was not an ordinary unit. These were volunteers selected for physical fitness and courage, trained to standards that exceeded regular infantry, and led by officers who were themselves veterans of multiple campaigns. Their commander, General Richard Heydrich, had fought in Crete, North Africa, and Russia before taking command at Cassino. His battalion commanders averaged 3 years of combat experience. The average German paratrooper at Cassino had completed 2 years of training before entering combat, compared to 6 months for American infantry replacements arriving in Italy in early 1944. This training differential showed in combat effectiveness. German paratroopers at Cassino consistently inflicted casualties at ratios exceeding 5-1. A typical German squad of 9 men could hold a position against Allied company attacks numbering 120 men or more. They did this through superior fieldcraft, better use of terrain, and tactical patience that allowed them to let Allied forces advance into killing zones before opening fire. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz, commanding a battalion in the 1st Parachute Division, described their defensive philosophy in his war diary. "We do not fire to drive the enemy back, we fire to kill the enemy. Every bullet must count because we cannot afford to waste ammunition. We wait until targets are certain, then we fire at decisive range." The enemy learns to fear positions where he cannot see us but knows we can see him. The Allied response to this tactical excellence was to employ their own elite formations. The choice of the 2nd Polish Corps for the final assault on Monte Cassino was deliberate. Anders' troops were motivated by factors beyond normal military discipline. They were fighting for national honour, for revenge against Germans who had invaded their country, and for recognition from allies who often treated Poland as a minor power. This motivation translated into tactical persistence that regular Allied formations couldn't match. Polish troops at Cassino accepted casualty rates that would have broken other units, and continued attacking when commanders expected them to withdraw. The lesson was clear: In the most difficult operations, elite formations with exceptional motivation were worth their weight in gold. This lesson would influence Allied planning for subsequent operations, particularly the airborne assaults on D-Day and Market Garden. The fourth lesson was perhaps the most controversial: the limits of international law and cultural protection in total war. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had established rules for protecting cultural monuments during warfare. Article 27 of the 1907 Convention specifically required belligerents to take all necessary steps to spare buildings dedicated to religion, art, science, and historic monuments. The bombing of Monte Cassino violated this provision, and everyone involved knew it. The justification was military necessity, the doctrine that military requirements override legal restrictions when survival is at stake. But defining military necessity is subjective. General Freyberg argued that the monastery's presence lowered his troops' morale, making its destruction necessary. General Clark argued that intact buildings were less defensible than rubble, making destruction counterproductive. Both men were competent commanders using the same available intelligence. They reached opposite conclusions about military necessity. The controversy led to post-war efforts to strengthen cultural heritage protection. In 1954, UNESCO convened a conference in The Hague that produced the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. This treaty, directly influenced by the Monte Cassino bombing, established clearer standards for protecting cultural sites and narrowed the definition of military necessity. It required belligerents to avoid locating military objectives near cultural sites and prohibited using cultural sites for military purposes. It created an international register of protected sites that would be immune from attack, except in extraordinary circumstances. The treaty represented an attempt to prevent future Monte Cassinos, though its effectiveness in actual conflicts has been mixed. Wars in the Balkans, Middle East, and elsewhere have seen repeated violations of cultural heritage protection, suggesting that the lessons of Monte Cassino were learned but not always applied. The human cost of Monte Cassino extended beyond the 75,000 military casualties to affect thousands of Italian civilians whose lives were destroyed by the battle. The town of Cassino, which had a pre-war population of 25,000, was completely destroyed. Not a single building remained intact. The population was scattered to refugee camps across southern Italy, living in conditions that barely met survival needs. They had lost their homes, their possessions, their livelihoods, and in many cases their family members. The monastery bombing killed 230 civilians sheltering in the abbey. The town bombing killed hundreds more. Artillery fire throughout the battle killed civilians who were caught between the lines or who made the fatal mistake of being visible at the wrong moment. Mines laid by both sides would kill Italian farmers for years after the war ended. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Maria Concetta, a Cassino resident who was 16 when the battle began, was interviewed by historians in 1994, 50 years after the events. Her testimony provides insight into civilian experience of the battle. We lived in the cellar for 3 months. My family, 12 people in a room 10 feet square. We could hear the shells landing above us. The walls shook. Dust fell continuously. We had almost no food. My younger brother died of dysentery because we had no medicine, no clean water. When we finally escaped to the Allied lines, we were walking skeletons. I weighed 80 pounds. My mother couldn't walk. We carried her. The soldiers who found us thought we were already dead. We were ghosts. Cassino made us ghosts. The Italian government's efforts to compensate Cassino survivors were inadequate and often corrupt. Reconstruction funds allocated for rebuilding homes were diverted by officials or lost to bureaucracy. Survivors waited years for compensation that, when it came, covered only a fraction of their losses. The town itself was not fully rebuilt until the 1960s, and even then, it was a new town built on the ruins of the old. The medieval street pattern was abandoned for modern planning. Ancient buildings that might have been restored were demolished to make way for new construction. The Cassino that emerged from reconstruction was functional, but culturally disconnected from the town that had been destroyed. Older residents spoke of 2 Cassinos, the town before the war and the town after, as if they were different places that happened to share a name. The monastery's reconstruction, funded by the Italian government and international donations, was a more visible effort that received more attention. Work began in 1948 and continued until 1956. Architects studied pre-war photographs and documents to recreate the monastery's appearance. Craftsmen were trained in traditional stoneworking techniques. Materials were sourced from the same quarries that had supplied stone for the original construction. The result was architecturally impressive, a building that looked almost identical to what had been destroyed. But it wasn't the same. The stones lacked the patina of centuries. The frescoes were modern copies, technically accurate but lacking the accumulated touch of generations of monks. The library was restocked with books, but the irreplaceable manuscripts were gone, destroyed in February 1944 except for those few items Lieutenant Schlegel had saved. Abbot Diamar survived the war but never returned to Monte Cassino. He died in 1945 at age 81, broken by the destruction of his life's work. His successor, Abbot Ildefonso Rea, oversaw the reconstruction and the monastery's reopening in 1956. At the dedication ceremony, attended by Italian government officials and Vatican representatives, Rea spoke about the monastery's destruction and reconstruction. What was lost cannot be recovered. 14 centuries of accumulated faith, scholarship, and art were erased in 4 hours. What we have rebuilt is beautiful, but it is new. It lacks the soul that only time can provide. We build for the future, knowing that the past is gone forever. The destruction of Monte Cassino is a permanent scar on the face of civilization, a reminder that war destroys without discrimination, consuming the sacred along with the profane. The military careers of commanders involved in the Cassino battles were affected differently by the outcome. General Freyberg, whose insistence on bombing the monastery had proven counterproductive, remained in command of the New Zealand Corps and later served as Governor-General of New Zealand. His reputation, built on decades of distinguished service, survived the controversy over his decision. General Clark, who opposed the bombing, commanded Fifth Army through the remainder of the Italian campaign and later commanded United Nations forces in Korea. His Italian service was controversial for other reasons, particularly his decision to prioritize Rome's capture over destroying German forces, but his opposition to bombing Cassino was vindicated by events. General Alexander, who authorized the bombing despite his own doubts, went on to command Allied forces in the Mediterranean and later served as Governor-General of Canada and British Minister of Defence. The bombing decision was a minor footnote in his long career. German commanders at Cassino received different treatment depending on when their service ended. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, who commanded 14th Panzer Corps responsible for the Cassino sector, survived the war and wrote a memoir that became a standard source for understanding German defensive operations. He was never prosecuted for war crimes, partly because his defence of Cassino was conducted according to the laws of war and partly because he was known to oppose the Nazi regime politically, even while serving it militarily. General Richard Heydrich, commanding the 1st Parachute Division, also survived and avoided prosecution. His unit's conduct at Cassino was professional, and they had not committed the atrocities that some German units in Italy were guilty of. In post-war interviews, both men expressed regret for the monastery's destruction, but maintained that the defensive battle had been necessary and properly conducted. The long-term strategic assessment of the Cassino battles has evolved over decades of historical analysis. Immediately after the war, the standard interpretation was that Cassino had been a necessary battle that delayed the Allied advance, but ultimately achieved its objective of breaking the Gustav Line. This view emphasized the battle's contribution to the overall Italian campaign and minimized the costs. By the 1960s, as more documents became available and veterans began publishing memoirs, a more critical view emerged. Historians questioned whether the frontal assaults had been necessary, whether the monastery bombing was justified, and whether the casualty rates were acceptable. Some argued that the entire Italian campaign was a strategic dead end that diverted resources from more important theatres. The modern historical consensus, represented in works by Rick Atkinson, James Holland, and other recent military historians, is more nuanced. The Cassino battles are now seen as tactically necessary, but operationally flawed. The Gustav Line had to be broken if the Italian campaign was to continue, making some battle at Cassino inevitable. But the repeated frontal assaults showed a failure of operational imagination, the unwillingness to accept that some positions cannot be taken by direct assault, regardless of how much force is applied. The breakthrough came only when Allied forces attacked along a broad front, using superior numbers to overwhelm German defences by simultaneous pressure at multiple points. This operational approach could have been attempted earlier, potentially avoiding some of the casualties incurred in the first 3 battles. The monastery bombing is now almost universally regarded as a mistake, both militarily counterproductive and culturally indefensible. The experience of individual soldiers at Cassino varied enormously depending on their role, their unit, and when they fought. For infantry in the assault waves, Cassino was hell on earth, a landscape of constant danger where survival was more luck than skill. Private Robert Wagner of the 36th Division, who survived the Rapido crossing, was wounded 3 more times in Italy and evacuated to the United States in December 1944. He never spoke about his experiences to his family, maintaining a silence about the war that was common among veterans of the most intense fighting. His son, interviewed by oral historians in 2004, said his father would wake screaming from nightmares about the Rapido until the day he died in 1989, 45 years after the battle, for supporting troops, artillerymen, engineers, supply personnel. Cassino was dangerous, but not continuously terrifying. They faced artillery fire, air attacks, and occasional ground combat, but they weren't making frontal assaults on prepared defences. Their war had moments of intense danger, punctuating longer periods of routine labour. For rear-area troops, Cassino was distant thunder and casualty reports, tragic but not personal, until friends failed to return from the front. The experience of war is rarely universal within an army. At any given moment during the Cassino battles, most Allied soldiers in Italy were not in direct combat, were not facing immediate death, were instead performing the logistical and administrative functions that kept the army operating. But the infantry doing the fighting and dying created the outcomes that history records, and their experience was what defined the battle. German soldiers at Cassino had a different experience shaped by their defensive role. They endured bombardments that Allied attackers did not, spending hours in bunkers while thousands of shells exploded overhead. The psychological strain of waiting under bombardment, unable to fight back, not knowing if the next shell would collapse the bunker and bury you alive, was different from the terror of advancing under fire. But German defenders also had the advantage of prepared positions, familiar terrain, and usually superior fields of fire. They could see attackers coming and shoot at visible targets, while Allied attackers often fired at positions they could only guess at. The German experience was one of isolation, small groups fighting independently, cut off from higher command, making tactical decisions based on immediate circumstances. This required initiative and tactical flexibility that German training emphasized more than Allied training did. The medical experience at Cassino revealed both the advances in military medicine and its continuing limitations. By 1944, penicillin was widely available to Allied forces, dramatically reducing deaths from infected wounds. Blood transfusions could be given at aid stations close to the front, replacing blood loss that would have been fatal in earlier wars. Surgical techniques had improved to the point where wounds that meant certain death in 1918 were survivable in 1944. The survival rate for wounded soldiers who reached medical care was approximately 95%, compared to perhaps 50% in World War I. But this assumed soldiers reached medical care. At Cassino, evacuation of wounded from forward positions was often impossible under fire. Men bled out from wounds that would have been survivable if treatment had been available. They died of shock while waiting for stretcher bearers who couldn't reach them. They froze to death on the mountain slopes, too badly wounded to seek shelter, but not wounded seriously enough to die quickly. Medical personnel at Cassino worked under impossible conditions. Aid stations were subjected to artillery fire. Hospitals behind the lines were bombed by German aircraft. Medical supplies ran short during intense fighting when casualties overwhelmed capacity. Dr. Howard Snyder, a battalion surgeon with the 36th Division, described treating casualties during the Rapido crossing. They came in faster than we could handle them. We were doing triage in the dark, sorting dying men from those who might survive, making decisions that should never be required. The aid station was a tent in a muddy field, lit by lanterns, with shells landing close enough to shake the ground. We had morphine and bandages and not much else. I watched men die who could have been saved with proper facilities, proper time, proper conditions. You never forget that. You never stop asking yourself if you made the right choices about who to treat first. The racial dynamics of the Cassino battle reflected broader patterns in World War II's Allied armies. The French Expeditionary Corps that played a crucial role in breaking the Gustav Line was composed largely of colonial troops from North and West Africa. Moroccan Goumiers, Algerian tirailleurs, and Senegalese infantry did much of the fighting while French officers commanded. These troops fought with exceptional skill in mountain warfare, using tactics learned in the Atlas Mountains and Sahara to infiltrate through terrain the Germans thought impassable. Their success opened the southern flank of the Gustav Line and forced the German withdrawal that allowed Polish troops to take Monte Cassino. Yet these African soldiers received little credit in contemporary accounts, were paid less than white soldiers, and were often treated as expendable by French commanders who accepted casualty rates among colonial troops that would have been unacceptable in white French units. The French colonial troops' conduct after breaking through German lines became controversial. In May 1944, as French forces advanced through the mountains south of Cassino, incidents of rape, murder and looting were reported in Italian villages. The scale of these atrocities remains disputed. Italian sources claim thousands of civilians were victimized. French military records acknowledge some incidents but describe them as isolated. Post-war investigations were incomplete, and most perpetrators were never identified or punished. The incident complicates the heroic narrative of the Cassino breakthrough, reminding us that armies fighting for just causes are still composed of individuals capable of committing crimes. The Allied command's muted response to allegations against French colonial troops, in contrast to harsh punishment of similar crimes by other units, suggests that racism influenced military justice as well as unit assignments. The Indian Army's role at Cassino has received more recognition over time, as historians have reassessed contributions of non-white troops to Allied victory. The 4th Indian Division that fought in the 2nd and 3rd Cassino battles was one of the most experienced formations in the British Army, having fought in North Africa, Ethiopia and Italy before reaching Cassino. The division included Gurkha battalions from Nepal, Punjabi units from what is now Pakistan, Rajputana and Marathas from India, and British battalions that gave the division its official designation as Indian, but its actual composition as multinational. These troops fought in conditions completely unlike their homelands, tropical soldiers struggling through snow and ice at high altitude, and they fought superbly. The Gurkha attack that captured Hangman's Hill in March 1944 was described by German defenders as the most terrifying assault they experienced at Cassino. Nepali soldiers advancing silently through darkness with their curved kukri knives, killing sentries before the alarm could be raised. The question of how many soldiers actually fought at Monte Cassino versus how many were present in the theatre is important for understanding the battle's scale. Casualty figures of 75,000 are often cited, but this represents losses over 4 months across multiple divisions that rotated through the battle. At any single time, perhaps 20,000 Allied troops were actively engaged in combat operations at Cassino, supported by another 50,000 in artillery, logistics and support roles. German strength in the Cassino sector varied between 10,000 and 15,000 combat troops, with support elements adding another 20,000. So while the campaign involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers overall, the actual fighting was done by a much smaller number who experienced combat intensity that rear area troops never faced. The environmental destruction at Cassino was lasting and significant. The mountainside was deforested by artillery fire, with trees shattered and burned across hundreds of acres. The town's olive groves and vineyards, which had been cultivated for centuries, were obliterated. The Rapido River valley was so heavily cratered by artillery that drainage patterns changed, creating swamps where dry land had been. Thousands of tons of unexploded ordnance remained buried in the soil, killing farmers and children for decades after the war. Mine clearance continued into the 1950s, and even today occasional discoveries are made of shells or mines from 1944. The limestone bedrock of Monte Cassino itself was fractured by explosions, changing the mountain's geology in ways that will persist for millennia. Human activity had scarred the landscape in ways that exceeded even natural disasters. The cultural memory of Monte Cassino differs significantly across national lines. In Poland, the battle holds a central place in World War II memory, taught in schools and commemorated annually. Taking the monastery represented a moment of Polish military achievement, when Poland itself existed only as an occupied territory divided between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Polish soldiers fighting at Cassino were fighting for a homeland most would never see again. The Soviet occupation of Poland after 1945 meant that many veterans remained in exile, settling in Britain, America, and other Western countries, rather than returning to a Poland controlled by communists. In New Zealand, Cassino is remembered as part of the nation's contribution to Allied victory, though the heavy casualties and limited success of New Zealand attacks has made it a more ambiguous memory than victories in the Desert War or Pacific campaigns. In India and Pakistan, Cassino receives little attention in popular memory, overshadowed by independence and partition in 1947 and by subsequent conflicts between the two nations. The soldiers who fought there are largely forgotten, except by regimental historians and military scholars. In Germany, Cassino is remembered as an example of skilled defensive fighting by the Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers whose performance exceeded that of regular infantry. But this memory is complicated by Germany's status as aggressor in the war and by the Nazi regime these soldiers served. Admiring their tactical skill means confronting the uncomfortable fact that they were fighting to prolong a criminal regime's existence. In Italy, Cassino memory is dominated by civilian suffering and cultural destruction, the battle representing foreign armies fighting on Italian soil with little regard for Italian lives or heritage. American memory of Cassino focuses primarily on the Rapido crossing disaster and the 36th Division's losses. The battle is taught at the US Army War College as an example of poorly planned operations that ignored terrain difficulties and overestimated the effects of supporting fire. But Cassino never achieved the cultural prominence in American memory that battles like D-Day or the Bulge did, partly because the Italian campaign as a whole was overshadowed by the invasion of France, partly because the Cassino battles were tactically unsuccessful until the final breakthrough. Veterans returned home and mostly remained silent about their experiences, and without their voices the battle faded from public consciousness. It became a specialist topic studied by military historians and Italian campaign enthusiasts, but unknown to most Americans. The monastery itself, in its rebuilt form, serves multiple memory functions. It's a working monastery again, home to a community of Benedictine monks who maintain the traditions re-established in 529 AD. It's a museum documenting the battle and the abbey's history. It's a pilgrimage site for Catholics who venerate St. Benedict. And it's a tourist destination where visitors can see the battlefield and surrounding countryside from the heights where German observers directed artillery fire. These functions sometimes conflict. Monks seeking contemplative quiet must accommodate thousands of annual visitors. Historical presentation must balance Italian, German, and Allied perspectives on events. The sacred and secular uses of the space create tensions that the monastery's administration manages with varying success. Walking the battlefield today is a strange experience for anyone familiar with the 1944 battle. The town of Cassino is fully rebuilt, a modern Italian town with no obvious signs of its complete destruction. Highway 6, the road that Allied forces fought so hard to open, is now a busy thoroughfare carrying truck traffic between Naples and Rome. The mountainside is reforested, though careful observers can still spot the traces of bunkers and trenches in the undergrowth. The Polish cemetery is immaculately maintained, a green space of ordered graves and memorial walls listing names of the dead. Standing there, looking up at the monastery on the summit, it's difficult to imagine the intensity of fighting that consumed this place for 4 months. The peaceful present obscures the violent past, as it does at most old battlefields, until imaginative effort reconstructs what happened here. The Cassino battles, viewed from 80 years' distance, represent a kind of warfare that modern armies have largely learned to avoid. Frontal assaults on prepared defensive positions in restrictive terrain are now considered unacceptable, except in the most extreme circumstances. Modern doctrine emphasizes maneuver, bypassing strong points, using precision weapons to neutralize defenses without having to assault them directly. When urban fighting is necessary, modern forces use small teams with precision weapons rather than massed assaults preceded by indiscriminate bombardment. These doctrinal changes owe much to lessons learned at places like Cassino, where older methods proved inadequate against determined defenders in strong positions. Yet the fundamental dynamic that made Cassino so difficult remains unchanged. When defenders occupy commanding terrain with clear fields of fire and solid protection, they hold enormous advantages over attackers. Technology hasn't eliminated this advantage, it's merely changed the specifics. Precision weapons can destroy some positions, but not those buried deep or well camouflaged. Infantry must still close with and destroy or capture enemy positions when no other method works. Men must still advance under fire, accept casualties, and continue fighting in circumstances that test human courage to its limits. The Monte Cassino battles remind us that some military problems have no clean solutions, that victory sometimes requires terrible costs, and that technological superiority cannot substitute for tactical excellence and soldiers' courage. The final assessment of Monte Cassino must balance several competing truths. The battle was strategically necessary to break the Gustav Line and continue the Allied advance toward Rome. The battle was tactically mishandled, with repeated frontal assaults that failed to achieve objectives at acceptable cost. The battle demonstrated both the best and worst of Allied military performance, tactical incompetence in planning, combined with extraordinary courage in execution. The battle destroyed irreplaceable cultural heritage in a way that was militarily counterproductive and morally questionable. The battle consumed 75,000 casualties to achieve objectives that might have been gained at lower cost through different operational approaches. All these statements are simultaneously true, and together they define what Monte Cassino represents in World War II history. For the soldiers who fought there, survivors carried memories that shaped the rest of their lives. Some were broken by the experience, unable to readjust to civilian life, haunted by memories of comrades killed beside them, of attacks that failed, of suffering without purpose. Others found that surviving Cassino gave them strength to face subsequent challenges, a measuring stick against which peacetime difficulties seemed manageable. Most veterans fell somewhere between these extremes, carrying memories they couldn't fully share with civilians who hadn't experienced combat, memories that faded but never entirely disappeared. The mountain had tested them, and they had survived, and that survival, however narrow, however much a matter of luck rather than virtue, gave their lives a definition that nothing in the civilian world could match. The mountain itself remains, unchanged in geological time by the battle that was so consequential in human time. Monte Cassino rises above the Liri Valley as it has for millions of years, its limestone peaks indifferent to the names carved on monuments at its base. The monastery crowns the summit, rebuilt and beautiful, a testament to human determination to preserve and restore what war destroys. The cemeteries hold their silent roll call of the dead, names and dates marking lives cut short in a battle most of the world has forgotten. And occasionally on anniversary dates, a few old men return to stand where they fought, remembering what happened here when they were young, when the mountain became a mountain of fire, when history was made at a cost too terrible to forget and too painful to remember.